Hey there, this is Becca, your friendly neighborhood podcast editor at Prepare to Answer. I hope you're having a Merry Christmas season so far. Today we're pulling an episode from the archives where Scott and Shawn discuss why we can have confidence that the Christmas story is true, particularly by looking at the trustworthiness of the Gospels. They'll be answering questions about supposed contradictions between the Gospel accounts, the differences in genealogies between Matthew and Luke, the dating of the Gospels, and the supernatural aspects of each Gospel. So, if you've ever wondered if you can really trust the Christmas story, or the Gospels in general, you're in the right place. So stay tuned to hear the full conversation, and thanks for listening.
God inspires these works through human authors to use their own personalities and the literary conventions of the day and human language to communicate spiritual but also historic truth.
You're listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And just a reminder that all the resources mentioned in this episode are linked in the episode description. You can find other related resources on our website at preparedtoanswer.org.
Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. My name is Shawn Walker, and I'm joined back in studio with Scott Steen.
Yep. Hi again, Shawn. Good to be back in studio to have a conversation.
A Christmas conversation,
in fact. That, yes.
Yeah. So what we thought we'd talk about today, Scott, as every Christmas comes around, and you were mentioning this, going into grocery stores as you're walking along, standing in line, waiting to pay for all your Christmas stuff, you notice on the magazine racks all the articles about Jesus.
Jesus is back.
He is back
in Newsweek. He's back in Life magazine. He's back on the grocery store checkouts. You bet.
Right. And a lot of the time the question is, was the story real? And, National Geographic is what happened at Christmas time real? Is it real history?
Right.
And so I think that's maybe something we could tackle and talk about today and from a couple different angles.
Sure.
And so, for Christians, we go back to the Gospels, right?
Yep.
The four Gospels to look at Christmas and say, here's where we see the Christmas story. And Scott, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, two of those four don't even have the story.
Right, sure. And I mean, there's so much going on with people kind of questioning the Christmas story. And in a way, you can understand. As you just pointed out, the Christmas story actually only occurs in two of the four Gospels. And of course, the Gospels are our main source material for our information about the story and the life of Jesus and his teachings. Of course, those stories, and we're heading into Christmas, and you and I are a part of a church where we'll be celebrating that. Many churches do pageants and things of that nature. But even in the broader culture, still there's, the Christmas cards, and there's these idyllic scenes of the nativity, and all the, and the cattle are almost bowing to baby Jesus, and there's light emanating. The way it's portrayed, you can understand why people look at that and say, this can't be history. Right. It's so sentimentalized and portrayed as this kind of mythical story in the way we wrap our Christmas presents and send our cards and all the rest. But you're right. Probably one of the biggest objections that people have is, we have four Gospels. There are broader objections about the Gospels that somehow we have these four accounts that in ways contradict each other, supposedly. But when it comes to talking about Christmas, only Matthew and Luke record the birth story of Jesus.
Right. And so the question would be, if it was so miraculous, if it was so great, why wouldn't all four write about it?
Yeah, and I think that's a legitimate question, and I think there's a good answer to that. I think in answering that question, we're really answering a larger question about the Gospels that kind of, in general, does speak to sometimes the charge that the Gospels contradict each other.
Okay.
Because they're not, it's like this isn't the same thing. John's Gospel looks very different from Mark and Luke and all the rest. Particularly John's, because the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share a lot of common material. But the larger issue is that because there are so many differences, people think, well, therefore they can't be true because it's like a different account of a story. In answering that, and also then to answer your question about the differences between Matthew and Luke's Christmas account and why they're there and not in the others, you have to realize that the gospel writers weren't just writing history. The way that we often think of historians, just, what we want in history is historians just sit down and they're writing just the bare facts. Right. Just give us the chronology of events. Mm-hmm. The gospel writers had a specific message. And of course, because it's scripture, they're communicating a spiritual message, a theological message. Right. They aren't just writing history, they're writing a message to an audience in their immediate context. They have people in mind that they want to communicate theological truth about Jesus too. Mm-hmm. And so they are being selective and they are being deliberate in how they choose the material that they're going to use and the way they present it. They're doing it very deliberately. Yeah. That doesn't mean it's not factual, that it's not historical. In one sense, you could liken it to you and I going to a dinner party and then coming together afterwards and writing a synopsis of our evening. Right. You're going to write from a different perspective. You're going to pick up on certain things, and I'm going to pick up on certain things. And if we're relaying the event to some friends or whatever, we're both going to spin it in a different way from our own perspectives, according to what we want to say about here's what you need to know about the party from my perspective and from yours. We're not telling the same account, but we are relaying this, real information about an actual event.
Right. And I guess to go along with that, it depends on the audience that we're talking to. So if I go with your analogy about the party, I may describe the party to my kids differently than I would to my parents.
Sure.
Or another friend.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the reality is, and I think this is something that people, especially Christians, realizing who we're speaking to, Shawn, I think more often than not, we believe we're talking to Christians. Our ministry mandate really is to help Christians feel confident about the faith that they profess in Christ and to be able to give a good answer. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there might be some unbelievers who are listening too, and I hope that they can get something out of this. But I think the one thing that Christians need to just be aware of and feel confident in affirming is that the differences between the Gospels reflect the fact that each author had his own specific reason for writing. Mm-hmm. And let me just give you this as an illustration because this is coming right out of the Gospels. Here's what John says at the end of his gospel. He states explicitly, this is why I'm writing. He says, at the very end of his gospel, he writes, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. That's worth remembering right there. We'll probably come back to that. Okay. He goes on, but these are written, in other words, these things I've just written, the ones I have included, they're written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Mm-hmm. So I mean, John's being very forthright. What he's selected, he hasn't told you everything, right? There's more stuff that he could tell you about Jesus. He's chosen some very specific stories, accounts of what Jesus said and did in order to convey a message, in order to accomplish a purpose that he has in mind. And he states it very clearly there. But, you flip over then to Luke. Mm-hmm. His gospel, Luke starts with stating clearly his purpose for writing. He's writing actually to Theophilus, who is probably most historians think Theophilus was his patron, but also a believer who Luke wanted to help ground and solidify for Theophilus and anyone else who would read it, their belief in Christ. So Luke says this, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. That there is very interesting in itself, Shawn, because Luke is already admitting other people have tried to write these things down too and come up with a formal accounting of the things that have been fulfilled. He says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And here's his purpose, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. There's so much in Luke's opening here, Shawn, that I think ought to give Christians confidence in the historicity of the gospel narratives. He's using the formal tools or forms of an historian. Right. He's saying, I've investigated these things. I've gone and done the research, and I'm doing what others have done, writing these up. And what I find really interesting is in verse 4, when he says, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught, he's stating that Theophilus already knows this stuff, right? At least in part. Right. This is not all novel information. Theophilus, you know, right, these things. I'm now writing a carefully investigated account going right back to the beginning, which gives us some reason why Luke includes the birth narrative, so that you can have certainty. And have confidence that these are the things you've been taught are the things that really occurred.
So what I love, though, is so Luke is writing from a historian's perspective.
Very much so.
But that's not all four Gospels. Mark and Matthew and John aren't writing from a historian. That's not their purpose, per se.
Well, whether you can say it's not their purpose, but it certainly isn't their form.
Right.
They have, I would say that Mark and Matthew and John, they are writing more from the form of teaching biblical theological truth.
Right. But within the Gospels, we have someone that is chronicling the facts, like a historian.
Right. But that's not to say also that Luke doesn't have a theological agenda, and he does.
Okay.
But you're right. He's just stating that the form and the way he's approaching his material is as an historian. He's gone back, he's talked to the eyewitnesses, and he's now chronicling what has already been in circulation for a long time, that Theophilus was fully aware of. It's worth noting there's a great book by Craig Blomberg called The Reliability of the New Testament. And he makes a statement I think it's worth pointing out. He says, we need to understand that the ancients didn't record history just for the sake of chronicling facts, which is the way we think of history. He says, in the ancient world, the idea of writing dispassionate, objective history merely to chronicle events with no ideological purpose was unheard of. Nobody did that. Nobody wrote history, he says, if there wasn't a reason to learn from it. So that's not just biblical history. That's the surrounding history of the Greeks and the Romans and anyone else. So that's worth remembering.
What would be the reason for Mark and John to not include the birth?
Well, simply put, just what we've been saying is because including that material didn't serve their overall purpose. It did not further the theological message that they were trying to convey. It's kind of like, I'm trying to make a point about something, and well, you know this full well from we've worked together long enough, Shawn. When I'm trying to make a point with you, I often get on a bunny trail and get distracted by, but this is important too. And all of a sudden, 5 minutes later, I've told you an entire story that has nothing to do with the point I was trying to make earlier, and then you kind of shake your head and tear your hair out.
That's right.
They didn't need the material.
No.
And John even says, there's a whole lot of other things that Jesus did, but I haven't recorded those. Because I've recorded these for the purpose for which I've written.
So what would be the teaching focus then of the different Gospels?
Yeah, well, actually, that's a great question, and that's a great thing for Christians to maybe make a study of. And sometimes even if you've got a good study Bible, like the NIV study Bible or the ESV study Bible, what I love about those kinds of tools is they give you introductory material before each book. So it gives you things like purpose and date and author and audience. And I think that's important that we recognize in understanding the message of a biblical writer, knowing the context in which they're writing helps us understand why they're writing. So, there's a lot that could be said about each one. It's tough to summarize the content of an entire gospel in a sentence, but if you looked at the themes, the overall teaching themes, Matthew's gospel, the main point seemed to be to communicate to his Jewish readers that Jesus was what is their awaited Messiah, as foretold in the Old Testament. And one of the giveaways to the fact that is his theme is the recurrence in Matthew's writings of, and this took place to fulfill what was written.
Interesting.
You can tell the way Matthew's writing, the material he's including, and the things he's assuming his readers know already. He's writing to Jews. And he's trying to communicate, look at this. He was the one we were waiting for, just the way the Old Testament told us. Mark was written to encourage persecuted Christians to endure through suffering, to really help them trust Jesus and his ultimate rule and authority as the Son of God. And two things that are really prevalent in Mark's gospel are the term Son of God and the repetition of the word or the communication of the idea that Jesus had authority. He showed he had authority in teaching He had authority over evil spirits. He showed authority over over nature when he calmed the storm. So those were two big themes. Why? Because Mark wanted to encourage, particularly Christians in Rome, who needed to know that the authority of Jesus and his rule was greater than that of Caesar, under whose hands they were feeling the heavy weight of persecution.
So that's interesting. Even just now we talked about two books and there's two different audiences.
Right. Oh, yeah. Luke, of course, we've just kind of stated that. Theophilus being the direct recipient, but Luke writing knowing that this would become a circular document.
Right.
I don't think he ever assumed that Theophilus would read this and then put it in a drawer forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
But he was seeking to confirm for believers, both Jews and Gentiles, that Jesus was the Savior of all, sent from God to save us.
Yeah.
And then John's gospel was to evangelize primarily Jews by showing that Jesus was in fact the Christ, the divine Son of God.
And you know what? Even with you talking about all those four differences, it starts to make sense, right? So even off the top of my head, just on that explanation of Mark, why would you include the birth story if your audience, you're trying to encourage persecuted Christians? Is that the most important, or is that one of the important things for Mark to be writing about? Probably not.
No.
But now if we do move to Matthew and Luke, so the two Gospels that do have the Christmas story or the Christmas birth account, there are variations even in those two stories.
Yeah, that's true.
Right, which will come up as an objection to say, look, even within the Gospels, they don't even know what's going on.
Yeah, that's true. I guess the quick response to that would be, well, as we've just said, authors chose and ordered and presented their material selectively in a way to communicate the truth that they wanted to teach.
Okay.
So you can apply that and look and see, okay, that would explain why Matthew and Luke don't have verbatim copies of the birth account. They crafted the story in the way that served their overall teaching point. Now, some would argue, but what we have in these two accounts are clear contradictions. So, for instance, in Matthew's account, we've got, the visit of the wise men. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are in a house, right? Herod makes a decree for the massacre of the 2-year-olds and under in Bethlehem out of fear of the Messiah raising out of Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt before returning. Right. So there's versus Luke's account where they're in the manger, the shepherds visit. Then after 8 days, Joseph and Mary take Jesus to the temple, right? Yeah, Simeon sees him and, thanks the Lord. There's differences. And then after that, it says they return to Nazareth. Right. After they'd completed everything that according to the law they needed to. So those are two very different accounts, but they don't necessarily present contradictions. Okay. They simply present variations in the amount of detail being presented. So those are not insurmountable things, but I think they just reflect the clear thematic emphasis of each gospel. Again, with Matthew, the fulfillment of this is what was said. He's including elements of Jesus' birth story that present the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Okay. My son will come out of Egypt, those kinds of things. Right. Whereas Luke has a very different purpose.
So one of the objections when we're looking at the birth account between Matthew and Luke is the differences in the genealogy.
Yeah.
How would we answer that?
Yeah, the differences in the genealogies between Matthew and Luke is one of the major objections that's often presented as evidence of, look, we're suspicious here that Matthew and Luke are not recording history, or at least one of them isn't, because they don't even have the same genealogy for Jesus. It does present a challenge, but there are a number of explanations that could resolve them, although none of them are conclusive. Probably one of the most long-standing explanations is that what's happening is that it's possible that Matthew follows Joseph in the genealogy, that he's following Joseph's bloodline in order to trace the legal royal descent of Jesus. He was to come from the house of David, right? And Joseph was a descendant of King David, the house of Bethlehem, David's hometown. That was Joseph's legal genealogy, and so that established the fact that Jesus would come from the household of David. Right. The explanation for Luke is that Luke then follows Mary's genealogy because Luke's interest is in establishing Jesus' bloodline, because Joseph was not biologically Jesus' father.
Okay.
But Mary did share a biology with Jesus, the bloodline.
Right.
And that Mary also could trace her lineage back to King David.
Okay.
And of course, in one of the other biggest differences in Luke's genealogy is that while Matthew traces it back to Abraham, Luke traces it all the way back to Adam.
Oh, interesting.
But again, that flows from what is clearly Luke's literary or teaching objective, communicating that Jesus is the Savior of the world, Jew and Gentile.
Because his audience was
his audience was Jew and Gentile.
So Matthew only needed to go back to Abraham.
Matthew needed to go back to Abraham because Matthew's interest was showing that Jesus was the fulfillment of messianic promise, beginning with Abraham in Genesis chapter 20. Through your seed, I will bless all nations, down to David. I will forever establish on your son, your bloodline will forever sit upon your throne. So that was important to Matthew. It wasn't unimportant to Luke. Because he was recognizing the importance of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, but he wanted to trace it all the way back to Adam to show that he was the Messiah for all man, for every person. So that's one viable explanation. There are some objections against it. They're grammatical. Some have to do with tradition, that it's not typical in Jewish genealogy to follow the line of a mother.
Sure. But this was an extraordinary situation, was it not?
It was, yes, it was. And so there are a number of ways of resolving some of those difficulties with that explanation. Is it a slam dunk? No. But they are reasonable explanations. It's also possible that there's a combination of legal and biological overlap between both of the men who are listed as Joseph's father. One in Matthew, it's Jacob. In Luke, it's Heli, with the idea that both Luke and Matthew are recording Joseph's genealogy. And this would be for those who would say, you know what, it seems highly unlikely that a Jewish genealogy would follow the mother's line, that what's happening here is that we have basically two variations of Joseph's genealogy, his legal genealogy, going back to David. One, of course, Matthew's interest is the royal line, because of royal, the fulfillment of that royal connection to David. Whereas Luke is following more of a biological line for Joseph. And it's interesting as well that the difference being that Luke takes Joseph's genealogy all the way back to David through David's son Nathan. Whereas Joseph begins with Solomon. Solomon's the direct royal heir, Nathan was a son of David, but not the one on the throne. So that's more evidence that it was David's bloodline through his son Nathan. But there was also this connection in terms of the royal line. And that what's happening with the two fathers listed is you have a possibility that Joseph could lay genealogical claim to both lines in a couple of different ways. It could be that Jacob, who's listed in Matthew, and Heli, who's listed in Luke, that they were brothers. And that Jacob died with no heir. So under Jewish Levirate marriage laws, it could be that Heli took Jacob's widow and therefore was the biological father of Joseph, while under Levirate marriage laws, Jacob would have been the legal father of Joseph, So there's a number of things going on because of the way Jewish lines and descent was kind of legally traced, and a number of laws that could explain the variation. Here's what Darrell Bach has to say. He summarizes. That's just 2 of 6 possible explanations. He says, what the options show is that it's premature to insist on error here, even though a definite solution doesn't emerge. And honestly, all of these are possibilities, and they all have pros and cons. None of them's a slam dunk, here's the reason. But what it shows is that, he says, nevertheless, the genealogy's point is obvious. Jesus has a claim to the throne through David and is related to all humanity through Adam. So it would be premature, and it would really not be even reasonable to insist that the differences, therefore, require an error was made somewhere. Something's going on, certainly, that requires an explanation. It does not require it to be a mistake.
No.
Or a deception, for that matter.
So one of the objections or questions, I guess, and this isn't only related to the Christmas story per se, but it's to the Gospels in general, is when they were written, basically after the events.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like they were written 70 years after the events. How can we trust anyone to be able to record what happened 70 years ago with any certainty?
Yeah, probably the first thing to say would be 70 would be a very, very liberal estimate of time. In fact, even most liberal scholars who call into question the apostolic authorship, even the latest estimates would be that they were written, the Gospels were written somewhere in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Right.
With probably Mark's being the earliest and John being the latest. So not quite 70 years. At the outside, maybe 50 years after Christ. So yeah, that's a common objection. And the objection, you're right, the way you kind of put it goes like this. Look at, if these events were true, I mean, why did they wait 40, 50 years to write them down? And hey, let's face it, after 40 or 50 years, who's getting all the facts straight anyway?
Broken telephone.
Right. It's like the telephone game, right?
Yeah.
And so what we really have in the Gospels are a series of, with some relayed facts about Jesus, mixed in with some mythological beliefs that were written backwards on the story and the life of Jesus by the people according to, kind of some of the beliefs that had emerged that they developed over time.
Right. So how would we answer those?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably a few things that we could speak to. I mean, first, let me just say, Shawn, that there have been volumes written in response to these questions.
Okay.
And we have some material on our own website. Our colleague Matt Belfay has some good material on his YouTube channel, Truth Snack, so you could look there. But there's a host of material. A few names you could look at would be, one would be Craig Blomberg, who is one of the foremost authors writing in defense of the historicity of the New Testament. Craig Evans is another one. There's a number of really sound, good theological scholars who've written about this. Maybe by way of just illustrating a few responses, I just wrote down this quote. This was a quote written by an author by the name of Karen Armstrong, who was a Catholic nun and then became an agnostic and started writing about the Bible in particular, the history of really religion and belief. But in her book, A History of God, here's a statement she makes that I think illustrates the objection you've just raised well. She says, "We know very little about Jesus. The first full-length account of his life was St. Mark's Gospel, which was not written until about the year 70, some 40 years after his death. By that time, historical facts had been overlaid with mythical elements which expressed the meaning Jesus had acquired for his followers. It is this meaning that St. Mark primarily conveys rather than a reliable, straightforward portrayal." And this is the broader question or the broader issue of those who want to question whether we can ever really know the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
And what's called into question are our source documents, which are the Gospels. Written too late, full of myth, so therefore really don't give us a lot of true factual information about Jesus.
Yeah.
I just want to focus on maybe the three things that she said that'll help us illustrate, I think, three good ways we can respond to that kind of objection.
Right.
Again, is any of this a slam dunk that will silence all objection? No. And I don't know that we ever give those kinds of answers.
Right.
What it does do, I think, is help supply Christians with good confidence that there are sound reasons that we can give.
Right.
That we're not just shutting our eyes and hoping it's all true.
And that we can be confident in the Scriptures.
That we can. Yeah. We can be confident in what God has preserved for us in the New Testament and the Old Testament too, but we're talking about the New Testament and the Gospels in particular. The first thing she says that I have a problem with is this. She says, by that time, right? Implying that the Gospels were written too late to be considered historical. It was just too long after Jesus. The facts would have gotten lost in history. As I said, out the outside, even liberals date in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Even at the outside, this is still within the living time frame of the eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
Many of them.
Wasn't that what Luke said at the start of his?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
He said, this is a record of the eyewitnesses.
Right.
Right? Those who were there. But it also includes, as Craig Blomberg pointed out in the book I mentioned earlier, it also includes many of those who would have been hostile to Christianity. So, you know what? The reality is 40 years really isn't that long when you think about the time span of history. If the gospel writers were making stuff up, or most of it, the people who could falsify their record were still alive.
Yeah.
They could say, hey, wait a minute, that didn't happen,
Yes.
right?
Right.
That's not how it all went down. And what the record actually indicates, so even with those late dates, it's still within the living time frame.
Yeah.
What the textual record actually indicates is that likely they were written even earlier.
Okay.
More likely the early 60s, which would shrink that gap to about 30. And here's some of the reasoning why. What Luke in particular, he gives us an account of the early church in the book of Acts.
Yep.
So the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are like volume 1 and volume 2.
Right.
Luke wrote them both.
Yep.
One was to tell about Jesus. The other was to tell about the church that came after him.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So what's interesting is that Luke records the early church in Acts, and his record of the church's activities and those involved, particularly Peter and the Apostle Paul, it ends with Paul's arrest. And it ends with an open-ended, the last scene of the book of Acts is Paul, he's imprisoned in Rome, he's under house arrest. Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. The end. That's the end of his gospel. Right. Okay. Luke makes no mention of Paul's execution under Nero.
Right.
Paul, we know from church history, is beheaded. We know that takes place between 62 and 64 AD. Nor does Luke mention the fall of Jerusalem, which we know Rome came and sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD, tore the temple down,
Right.
never to be built again.
And you would expect from a historian like Luke, some pretty big events.
That was a huge event, and it would have been a huge event in the life of the church, particularly the church in Jerusalem.
Right.
No mention.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's significant. And we know that Luke wrote his gospel prior to Acts.
Right.
Right? Because
Yeah.
Acts was the sequel.
Right. Exactly.
And we also know textual critics, and by critics I mean those who evaluate and analyze the text. I don't mean people who are critical,
Right.
In a negative way. We know from the work that textual critics do that Luke has incorporated part of Mark's gospel into his own work. There are those who study the synoptic, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those gospels, and they look and they see that there's a lot of shared material.
Right.
And what they've been able to deduce from looking at who's sharing what and where and how, they have a good read on whose gospel came first.
Yeah.
Matthew begins the New Testament. Most historians would say that Mark's gospel was written first.
Okay.
Matthew and Luke both borrow material from Mark.
Okay.
So we know that Luke incorporated parts of Mark into his own work, which means Mark must have been written even earlier than Luke.
Wow. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if Acts had to be earlier than Paul's death in 62 to 64, and Luke preceded Acts and Mark preceded Luke, well, now we're conservatively into the late 50s.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
At the outside, maybe 60, 61. If they all worked really quickly, one after the other.
Right. Yeah.
And here's a good comparison. And so it doesn't sound like special pleading here that I'm trying to make dismiss an argument that's worth making as if I have a bias.
Sure.
I do have a bias. I'm in favor of the Bible, but it's not a blind one. Here's a secular comparison. The 4 primary sources that we have for Alexander the Great, that figure from history, that great world conqueror from Greece.
Yes.
We have 4 primary sources that we use for the historical record of Alexander the Great. The earliest dates to within 280 years.
280.
The oldest is 400 years.
Right.
So between 280 years and 400 years from the actual events,
Right.
that's where we get our historical material for Alexander the Great from.
Right.
Well, I don't know a historian in the world who dismisses the historicity of Alexander the Great.
Right. So.
It was too long after.
Okay.
They didn't have any of the facts. Right?
So he didn't exist. Alexander the Great didn't exist.
Yeah, or everything was made up.
Right.
Now, it's not to say that they might have not embellished or added some things in there that historians could say, well, that's maybe an embellishment or whatever. But for the most part, the record's taken as historic.
Sure.
Right.
And so when we look at the Gospels, we're saying that
to say that Alexander the Great existed, that's 280 years. Now we're going to the Gospels,
Right.
and that's written within, on a conservative estimate, 60 years.
Oh, at the outside, if you're
Right.
talking about John's Gospel.
Right.
But remembering then John's Gospel, though it doesn't reflect the Synoptic Gospels,
Mhm.
they're already in circulation.
Right. So to me, that would demonstrate pretty good confidence that what was written was true.
Well, I think it's reasonable,
Yeah.
right? Unless you have, and again, some people say, yeah, but the history of Alexander the Great wasn't religious. People weren't writing down religious beliefs. Well, then I think that's special pleading.
Right.
Why do we apply a more stringent historical standard
Mhm.
to documents that were written by a believing community
Right.
about the founder of their faith than we do to quote unquote secular or a world leader from history? So the first objection she makes about by that time, as if too much time had passed,
Yeah.
I don't think that stands.
No.
The second problem I see is when she says this. She said, by that time, historical facts had been overlaid with mythical, that is, non-historic elements. Well, to say that, what's the obvious question that pops into your head?
Right. How do you determine what's history and what's mythical?
Yeah, it seems the obvious question that raises is, well, wait a second. If you're saying that it contains both historical facts and mythical elements, what's the criteria that you're using to determine one from the other?
Right.
Now, the simplistic approach that we mentioned earlier was to say, well, we know it's mythical because Mark and John didn't include it. Right? If it was historic and it was important and it was miraculous, they all would have included it. Well, we've already responded to that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? That doesn't necessarily follow because the authors had their own particular objective in writing.
Right.
I think what we also need to question, though, is the presuppositions or the pre-existing assumptions of those who make that kind of claim.
Right.
That this should be taken as myth versus this should be taken as historic. Skepticism of the miraculous has a long history, going all the way back to David Hume, all the way back to Enlightenment rationalism. Without being simplistic, I'm not going to try and summarize the entire history of skepticism.
Right. Yeah.
The basic thrust is that for any given event, we'll call that event E, that the best explanation is the one with the highest degree of probability.
Sure.
You should always go with the explanation that's the highest probability.
Right.
And the rationale goes, since we know that the world operates according to a set of fixed natural laws, then the most probable explanation for any event, E, is the explanation that is in keeping with natural laws.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going with the least probable.
Right.
And since miracles are, by definition, the breaking of natural laws, right? It's that which is not natural.
Right.
A miraculous explanation for events is always the least probable, right? That's kind of the general vein of skeptical thought and the way that miracles are often approached.
Right.
Look at, if you can believe a natural explanation, why would you not choose that, since that would be the most probable explanation?
Sure.
For example, dead men don't come back to life. Someone claims that a friend they know came back to life and appeared to them, right? And so we would hear that and we'd immediately rule that explanation out as a possibility, because in every other case in history, this rule of nature seems to apply, that dead people don't come back to life.
Right.
In fact, I looked it up. The estimate is that, and this is a number of sources, the estimate is that in the entire history of humanity on Earth, there have been about 108 billion people to ever live on the Earth. There's about 8+ billion now, but throughout all of history, that's about 108 billion. That's the estimates. So that means that the odds that this friend of ours, or that this person telling us about their friend raising from the dead, the odds of that being true are 1 in 108 billion.
Right.
Right? That's just so astronomically improbable that you would be irrational to think that. Right?
Yeah.
The problem, or the mistake this makes, though, is to mistake the value of the quantity of evidence with the quality of evidence.
Right.
And let me give you an example to illustrate. Based on that kind of reasoning, if evaluating the occurrences of miracles in that way would mean that we could never believe, for instance, that someone would ever be dealt a perfect hand in bridge. Could never happen.
Yes.
Or it's so astronomically improbable, because that would be the chances of that, mathematicians have calculated, the chances of being dealt a perfect hand in bridge is 1 in 1,635,013,559,600. Right. Over a trillion and a half to 1 are the odds.
So it'll never happen.
So if it did happen, right, if you're in a game and look, I got the perfect hand of bridge,
yes,
you would say, no, you didn't. Because the odds of that happening are so improbable that I would be foolish to believe that actually occurred.
Right.
Except it did.
Right.
And so in a case like that, you realize you're accepting the facts based on something other than probability.
Right.
You're now evaluating the quality of the evidence. In this case, it's what you're seeing with your own eyes. Maybe what those at the rest of the card table are also seeing and acknowledging. Right. So there's a qualitative evaluation of evidence going on.
So, and if we evaluated history that way throughout our life, then the Leafs would never win the cup again. The probability of that happening is next to nothing.
I don't think we want to antagonize any of our listeners who are avid Leafs fans. This is the year, Shawn. It's going to happen. I'm telling you, this is the year. You're not a believer.
That's right.
Okay, so that's part of the history of skepticism around miracles. It's this idea that you would be foolish to believe such an improbably high explanation for an event. Much more probable that it happened by natural causes. But also hidden in there, I think, is in lots of skepticism, in a lot of these kind of skeptical arguments or stances to the miraculous, is the principle of analogy for explaining historical events. And that's something that critical historians and critical biblical scholars sometimes appeal to. The principle of analogy basically says this, that when evaluating historical events, that this assumes that what we have recorded from history should be understood by comparison to what happens or might happen today. Right? So we understand history by way of analogy with what we understand happening in our own context.
Sure. Right.
And part of that is kind of a uniformitarian view of reality that natural laws don't change over time. So, but what this tends to do, though, is smuggle in the prevailing assumptions of naturalism that I think is very much entrenched in our cultural mindset that insists that everything can and should be explained according to natural causes or natural laws. But that just dismisses the possibility of the miraculous simply by presupposing the non-existence of the supernatural.
Right. Yeah.
It couldn't have occurred. Well, how do you know that? Because everything that does occur happens because of natural causes. We know that everything that happens as a result of natural causes. Supernatural is by definition outside of natural.
Right.
So it couldn't be that.
No.
Now, as a Christian, my worldview presupposes the supernatural.
Sure.
Like my beginning assumption is God.
Right.
In which case, the occasion of supernatural events isn't a problem for me.
No.
That doesn't mean something that seems miraculous automatically is, or that I'll just jump to that conclusion.
Sure.
But at least for me, it leaves the option open and allows me to consider the quality of other supporting evidence without ruling the miraculous out ahead of time. And saying that, no matter what, we're going to find some way to explain this naturally. And if we can, that means that's how it happened.
Right.
Right. Okay, the third problem that I see in what she says, which I think is a principle that, again, needs to be addressed, Shawn, is she says, by that time, we addressed the issue of time. The historical facts had been overlaid with mythical elements. Again, that begs the question, well, how do you determine the mythical from the historical? But then she says, which expressed the meaning Jesus had acquired for his followers. All right. That statement captures this idea that Jesus' divine nature, his miraculous ministry, his resurrection from the dead, that these were all spiritualized beliefs that later Christians formed and then projected back upon Jesus' life as they wrote out the Gospels, right? And unfortunately, I think that plays well into kind of the assumptions that, what are people most prone to do is after a period of time, they embellish stories and they add things that weren't there, and that's what's going on. It plays into that nicely. What it fails to recognize, Shawn, is that the Gospels are not our earliest records of Christian beliefs about Jesus.
So even though they're the start of the New Testament.
Yeah. They're not the earliest. And I think that sometimes confuses people that somehow, well, the Gospels, that's where we learn about what Christians thought of Jesus. And look, they were written so much later. You know how things go, right? So they wrote these beliefs back, but those aren't. They're not the earliest records of what Christians believed. In fact, really, it's the Apostle Paul's writings that predate the Gospels that really give us a good, solid foundation for understanding how Christians viewed Christ pre even the writing of the Gospels. The 4 Gospels are just not our earliest records. For instance, Paul's letter to the Philippians is dated somewhere around 61. His letter to the Colossians is dated around 60 AD. And his letters, most significantly, his letter to 1 Corinthians, to the church in Corinth, even liberal scholars date this somewhere around 55 AD. Virtually no scholar, liberal or conservative, denies or calls into question the authorship of Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
We know this is Paul's writing. Okay. So he writes this in 55 AD. Now, I mentioned those 3 books in particular, Shawn, because in each of those books, they were Paul's letters. In each of those letters, we find Christian creeds. Paul is repeating creeds that already existed among the living church community, the New Testament community at his time. And even prior to that. I don't have time to go into all of them. Each one would deserve its own look. But I think in particular, of particular note is 1 Corinthians 15. And in 1 Corinthians 15, if you go and read that, it reads like a piece of rabbinic teaching, the language and the form that Paul uses. What he says in that passage, starting in chapter 15, verse 1, he says, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you." So this actually predates 55 because he's talking now about something he already said to them, past tense.
Yep.
He says, "which you've received and on which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you believed in vain." And then he says this, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." And then he goes out and he lays out in this creedal form. I receive. What did he receive? That Christ died for our sins according to Scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, that he appeared, and he basically goes through what bears the resemblance of a creedal statement.
Right.
Now, what's really interesting and what scholars, language scholars have seen as they've analyzed this passage, they see the rabbinic patterns. What I received, I passed on to you. That reflects Jewish rabbinic teaching, which was oral, right? The rabbi is the master, the students learn, and the master passes on too. What I received, I passed on to you, my students.
Right.
Paul is very familiar with rabbinic, right? He was a Pharisee, right? He was trained in Pharisaical school. He understood the rabbinic kind of writings. Now, what language scholars have found, though, is that, of course, Paul's letters, the New Testament, all of the New Testament, was written in the common Greek of the day, sometimes called Koine Greek. But what language scholars recognize when they analyze the grammar and the structure of the passage here is they see reflections of not Greek, but Aramaic grammar. And that's significant because the New Testament wasn't written in Aramaic. It was written in Greek.
Okay.
Aramaic was the spoken language of Jesus and his disciples, the New Testament church, in particular the Jewish church. So Paul is quoting a creed that reflects Aramaic oral tradition. He's saying, what I received, here's what I got, and I've passed it on to you. And so in looking at that, what we have in Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 15 from 55 AD is Paul pointing back to a time where he received an already existing oral tradition, an oral creed held and taught by the Christian church,
right?
The Aramaic Christian church, the Aramaic
language
speaking,
of the day,
the Aramaic speaking Christian church, right? And if we look at the rest of Paul's writings, as well as the book of Acts, we know when he received that, or the earliest point at which he would have. And Paul talks about in Galatians how after his conversion, the road to Damascus, Jesus confronted him, the resurrected Jesus, in a vision, confronted Paul, called him into ministry, right, out of darkness. That's in Acts chapter 9. Paul then tells us in Galatians how after 3 years then he went up to Jerusalem For 3 years, he proclaimed the gospel. He didn't consult anyone, he says, but he professed it, that Christ was the Messiah, as understood from the Old Testament. The lights came on for Paul. But then after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem, and he says he met with Peter, the apostle, and James, the Lord's brother.
Right.
So, again, going back and looking at the dating, historians estimate that Paul's conversion took place anywhere between 33 and 36 AD. Sometime after the resurrection of Jesus. We don't know exactly how soon, but as early as 33, as late as 36.
Right.
Then 3 years later, he went up to Jerusalem and met with Peter.
Right.
Then he was in a position to receive the official word, right, from, the official guys.
Yeah.
Peter,
from the horse's mouth.
Right. Peter in particular, for the horse's mouth. Peter in particular. And so what we have then, depending on the time frame, we have in Paul's writing here an eyewitness testimony saying that here is the oral tradition he received, going back to as close to Jesus' resurrection at the outside to within 6 years.
Wow. At
the inside to within 3 years.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the notion that somehow the divinity of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, the idea that these were later inventions just does not stand up to the historical record.
Yeah.
It fits well into conspiracy theories that are suspicious of everything.
Yes. Yeah.
But if we just allow the New Testament to speak as a document from history, as an eyewitness record of people who lived and were recording what they had learned and seen and witnessed, it takes us right back to the very time or very close to.
And that's fascinating. The Aramaic, to me, that's fascinating that they're seeing that in 1 Corinthians, right? And that's the language that was spoken during Jesus' ministry.
And it's what you would expect.
Right.
If indeed Paul is being truthful in what he's saying.
Right.
If this is what he received from Peter and James, he would have received it in Aramaic. He would have learned it in Aramaic. He would have recited it in Aramaic. Writing it later in Greek, you wouldn't be surprised to find that it bears some marks of Aramaism in its structure.
Right. Where if it was made up later, you would just use it in the vernacular that you're using. Greek.
It would have been written in exactly traditional Greek form.
Right.
Of the day.
Right. So I think if we're going to wrap up for time's sake here, Scott, we can go back to the question that we started off with, which is the Christmas story a myth? And I think what we've seen is there's good evidence to say that there isn't. I feel like, Scott, that we've just scratched the surface on this. And in fact, on our website, do we not have more material that people can get to?
We have some, and certainly there's tons of material. But yeah, if you go to our website, we actually wrote an article a couple of years ago, the title of which is the Christmas story historical? And if you're interested, you could look at that. We've got a few other resources related to the question around Christmas, as well as the reliability of the New Testament. Also, our colleague Matt Belfay on his YouTube channel, Truth Snack, Matt's got some great little videos speaking to the reliability of the New Testament record. And there are lots of other resources as well. But yeah, Shawn, I mean, we started with the question of, whether or not the Christmas story is myth. And again, I think we have to be careful in our tone and our posture that we don't, in your face, look, here's the evidence, you have to believe, right?
Yes.
And realizing that more often than not, our expectation, Shawn, with Prepared to Answer here, is that our audience are likely Christians. And what we're trying to do is help Christians feel confident to be able to hold to the faith that we have with confidence. And realizing that, we can parse historical records and evidence all you like, and there's always going to be a rebuttal from someone. Oh, yeah, but what about this? And sometimes it can become a back and forth thing. But I think when it comes to the New Testament record and looking at the evidence openly and objectively, there's just too much good reason to say, look, no, we do believe this is history. Are the accounts, the way that they're written, is that exactly how it happened, moment for moment, word for word? No, it's literature, right? There's a genre of literature going on in gospel here. We talked about this earlier. It's selective, it's stylized, it's written and formed in order to communicate a greater theological truth. But that doesn't mean it's not historical.
Right.
For instance, I use this example, I mentioned this to you earlier. In Luke's account, you have Mary visiting Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is expecting this miraculous baby, John the Baptist, who's going to be the forerunner to the Messiah. And when Mary shows up, Elizabeth says, the baby in my womb leapt for joy.
Right.
Well, obviously she's saying something happened. The baby started a-kicking.
Right.
And there's maybe some interpretation there. But then Luke records right after that, Mary bursts into this song. Right?
Mary, did you know?
Right. Did Mary actually burst into song right at that moment? And then this highly stylized and carefully crafted poetic song flowed out of her mouth.
Joseph on the guitar.
Yeah. I don't think so.
No.
But what we have is Luke recording Mary's accounting, and likely in that she's sharing very much her heart and her recollections of all that was going on in her heart and mind when these events took place. And so somehow Luke crafts that into her song, representing her reflections and her thoughts at the time, but also communicating the truth about what's being revealed to Mary that's causing her to react this way. Yeah. All these truths about Jesus and God's faithfulness and God being Savior. So I think we always have to recognize that there's literary license going on in the New Testament, in all of the scriptural writings. It's literature, right? Yeah. And God inspires these works through human authors to use their own personalities and the literary conventions of the day and human language to communicate spiritual but also historic truth. Yeah. So we can't just keep forcing, our expectations of a historical record onto the text over and over again. But certainly we do. We have enough here to say with confidence, no, these things did happen.
Part of Prepared to Answer's ministry is helping Christians to have confident belief in Scripture. But even more so than that, from this podcast, what I've taken away, and we talked about this a little earlier, is even the audiences that the Gospels were written to helps me when I am reading those Gospels now, right? Not only am I confident in the historical aspects to them, but now it helps me when I'm reading them to understand that this is who this gospel writer was writing to, and this is why. Right. I hope our listeners have also caught on to that, and when they're studying that, they can have a new appreciation for the Gospels and why they're written the way they're written.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. What a great topic for Christmas time.
Yeah, it is. It's an appropriate topic for Christmas. It's one that comes up. These are often objections. I've seen them all over most social media and things like that. Right. It just comes up in our consciousness, and it's good to revisit them.
Good. Well, I think that's where we'll end for now, and we want to wish all of our listeners a Merry Christmas and God bless.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with us, feel free to email us at info@preparedtoanswer.org, contact us through Facebook or Instagram @preparedtoanswer, or use the contact form on our website, preparedtoanswer.org.